Le capitalisme engendre une dynamique permanente d'accumulation, de crise et d'innovation.
I believe that open markets and free enterprise are the best imaginable force for improving human wealth and happiness.
Je pense que les forces sociales et politiques sont les forces centrales dans la dynamique du capitalisme.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism?
Is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
How would Smith see the economic world around us?
I think Keynes would have said the problem is the hole in the economy.
Hayek really wrote The Road to Serfdom as a warning.
You always have to be careful with Marx about the one-liners. You know.
Polanyi, for me, was an intellectual earthquake.
I mean, if I had to stereotype Ricardo, I would say he would look like George Soros.
Si vous retournez chez Adam Smith, Marx, Schumpeter, vous avez des embryons de mécanismes vous permettant de comprendre la crise actuelle.
We were told that capitalism is the product of big thinkers and big ideas. But is it true? How did ideas shape our lives? What is their relation to reality? Can they help us understand today's economic crisis, let alone the future of capitalism?
Smith moved to this house in 1778. That's 2 years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations. It's quite likely that this was the fireplace of the room in which Smith staged the most disastrous moment in his intellectual career. He did not want any of his unpolished, unfinished manuscripts to survive him. And he laid down in his will that his 2 executors were to burn these papers after his death. But that wasn't enough. And really, almost days before his death, he summoned his executors and said, "I want you to do it now." And they sat there in front of the fire and systematically burned all his unpublished manuscripts. What has survived was simply 2 highly polished works, his great theory of moral sentiments and his even greater Wealth of Nations.
The Wealth of Nations, which survived the fire, has been presented over the centuries as the founding book of the free market system. Many of Adam Smith's notes were destroyed in the fire, leaving us with only this book and the interpretations of those who have used it to promote the very narrow view of the market as a science.
The history of The Wealth of Nations as a book is actually quite interesting. If you look at the first edition, it's an expensive production, and it looks to me as though this was a book destined for a specialist market, a market of philosophers, a market of politicians. But what's interesting is by the time you get to the latter part of Smith's life, to the edition of 1784, it's now become a cheap edition. It's now become a mass-produced edition. In other words, what's intended for a specialist market is now becoming something like a bestseller. And it's going to stay like that. The book has never been out of print. It's always been a bestseller. It does raise questions about what turns a specialist book like that into a bestseller. I think part of it is that it looked as though Smith had actually done what Newton did for the natural sciences. That he had actually discovered a principle, a law of movement, a law of motion.
Je crois que Adam Smith a créé le cadre conceptuel de la théorie moderne contemporaine, des individus en interaction sur des marchés. Mais il n'a pas fait de modèle, il n'a pas quantifié. Pour lui, c'était une vision de l'économie marchande. La révolution est arrivée au milieu du XIXe siècle, lorsque les économistes ont pris les outils de la physique newtonienne pour l'appliquer à l'économie. Au point que là, l'illusion a été de trouver l'équivalent des lois physiques pour l'économie.
It's hard to imagine how this primitive smelter in Calcutta, India, has anything to do with the wealth of nations. But work here is following the first principle of Adam Smith's book, division of labor, a principle which after Smith's death has been elevated to a scientific law.
One of the characteristics of the society you know that I know is the intense degree of specialization which takes place in employments, ranging from the most skilled and complicated employments to the most simple.
To take an example, the trade of a pin maker could perhaps, with his utmost industry, make 1 pin a day. But in the way this business is now being carried on, one draws out the wire, another straightens it, another cuts it, a fourth points it. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men make among themselves 12 pounds of pins a day. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations.
So he comes to the conclusion that progress, economic progress, has got everything to do with the division of labor.
No wonder the division of labor has been treated as the equivalent of a Newtonian law. After all, it has been the engine of wealth creation used in the manufacture of almost every product we know. From a sophisticated iPad to a single pencil. For Smith's followers, the division of labor has become a pillar of the free market economy.
To enable millions of people to cooperate peacefully together, we need to understand how it is that a free market works. I know no better way to bring this out than by a very simple example called I the Pencil. This is the only prop I have for this TV show. As you can see, it's a plain yellow pencil. There's nobody in the world who knows how to make a pencil. Now that seems like a silly thing to say, isn't it? This is just the most obvious thing. It's only a piece of wood with something black in the middle and the little red tip at the end. What do you mean nobody knows how to make a pencil? Well, suppose you were to start to set out to make a pencil. First of all, you have to get some wood, don't you? Where do you get the wood? You have to go to the Pacific Northwest, probably, and cut down some trees. How do you cut down some trees? You have to have some saws to cut it with. Where do you get the saws? You have to have some steel. Where do you get the steel? You have to have a steel mill. In order to have the steel mill, you have to get the iron ore, and you can add all the rest. But that's only the beginning. This black stuff in the middle that we call lead isn't lead. It's graphite, I think. I'm not absolutely sure. And I am told it comes from some mines in South America. Now, this little red tip at the top, that's rubber. Where's it come from? Well, the major source of natural rubber is Malaya. But the miracle of this pencil isn't that nobody knows how to make it. The miracle of the pencil is how did it get made? What is it that has enabled this little elementary transaction to take place. Now, how is that brought about? Is there some commissar sitting in some central office who is sending out orders to these people in Malaya, to these people in South America, to the people in Washington? How is it that they are led to cooperate with one another? These thousands of people who have been led to engage in this simple transaction, not one of them has been forced to do it. Nobody has had a gun to his head. They've all done it. Why? Because each one of them thinks he's better off in this transaction.
En fait, le mot liberté joue un rôle énorme dans la diffusion du libéralisme, puisque l'idée intuitive est suivante: pourquoi enlever à quelqu'un le droit de transacter sur un marché? C'est un droit élémentaire, et pourquoi ça serait mauvais? Eh bien, c'est tout simplement que, par exemple, si je suis un pauvre paysan qui négocie par rapport à une grande multinationale, c'est la multinationale qui fait le prix et pas moi. Donc, le premier élément, c'est que je suis libre de transacter sous un effet d'asymétrie du pouvoir qui fait que je n'ai aucun rôle dans la formation du prix.
An iPad factory in Shenzhen, China. A global assembly line for parts that come from all over the world. The 21st century global version of Adam Smith's pin factory. There are 250,000 workers in this factory, producing close to 10,000 iPads a day. But can we call the workers who manufacture them free?
我们做的工作也是就是流水线，然后机台留下来，我们也就是做的就是很机械的事情，就是测试这个机台。所以说生活嘛，我感觉工作嘛，我感觉还是蛮枯燥的。在富士康在这里面人员被高度的分化，就是说你同一个地方来的，就是说你在一个地方工作的话，也不可能住在一个地方。这边的人，城市里的人都是被高度分化的。用我们经常说的一句话就是，离家的孩子像根草。
So this is the moral dilemma at the heart of the wealth of nations. The economic logic of division of labor versus the human cost to achieve it. But was Adam Smith blind to this dilemma?
Adam Smith is very rarely read. He's worshipped, but not read. I mean, everyone who went to college learned the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations.
The greatest improvements in the productive power of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment seem to have been the effects for the division of labor. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations.
Not very many people got to page, whatever it is, page 400, in which he points out that division of labor is monstrous.
In the progress of the division of labor, a great body of people comes to be confined to a few very simple operations. The worker has no occasion to exert his understanding. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations.
It turns people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a person can possibly be. It's a person who just becomes a machine. That's a terrible attack on fundamental human rights. And therefore, he says, in any civilized society, the government is going to have to intervene to prevent division of labor. How many people get that far?
The Industrial Revolution was founded upon the creation of a factory system with large-scale machinery and, of course, a labor process. It was very different from that which artisans making their, cabinets or so on engaged in. It was completely different machine technology, which then was dominating. The machine controls the labourer rather than labour controlling the tool, which was true of artisan production. And of course social relations do indeed change. The labourer in the factory has a very different set of social relations with other labourers and a very different set of relations with the tools, a very different relation to nature than the artisan in a workshop sort of, making a cabinet or whatever.
For centuries, economists and politicians ignored Adam Smith's own recognition of the moral dilemma at the heart of division of labor. Self-interest, his second most quoted principle, suffered a similar fate.
Please welcome the Nobel laureate in economics, Milton Friedman, right? Let's share with the people at home just one of the statements of Adam Smith that you refer to in your book, which of course when I want it I'm not going to be able to, oh, it's on page 2. All right, thank you. By pursuing his own interest, that is to say, his meaning the person engaged in free enterprise, Adam Smith says, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it.
You're listening to Business Scholar. Adam Smith considered self-interest as the driving force of the economy. But do we know what he actually meant by it? To find out, we must first explore the times in which he lived.
אדם סמית הוא ילד של המהפכה המדעית ושל האמונה הבסיסית ביותר של המהפכה המדעית, שזאת היא האמונה בקדמה. רוב ההיסטוריה, רוב בני האדם תפסו את ההיסטוריה כקפואה ואפילו מדרדרת. ובמישור הכלכלי, האמונה הזאת בהיסטוריה הקפואה ומדרדרת הייתה תפיסה מאוד מאוד נפוצה, שאי אפשר להגדיל את סך העושר בעולם. סך העושר בעולם הוא קבוע, כמו איזו עוגה כזאת, ואתה יכול לחתוך את העוגה בהרבה מאוד דרכים שונות. אבל רווח של אחד תמיד יבוא על חשבון ההפסד של מישהו אחר. כלומר, הכלכלה היא משחק סכום אפס. אדם סמית אומר, הכלכלה היא מה שנקרא win-win situation. כולם יכולים להרוויח. הקדמה פירושה במישור הכלכלי זה שאפשר להעלות את סך הייצור ואת סך העושר בכל העולם, מה שאומר שהכלכלה היא לא משחק סכום אפס, וזה הבסיס באמת אולי לרעיון, שהוא לא רק רעיון כלכלי, אלא רעיון מוסרי, החשוב ביותר של אדם סמית, שאגואיזם זה אלטרואיזם. הרווח הפרטי שלי הוא משהו שעושה טוב לא רק לעצמי, אלא לכולם, הוא בעצם מגדיל את העוגה של העושר העולמי, ומאפשר לעוד אנשים ליהנות מזה, ובבן אדם העשיר יקנה מוצרים מהאנשים האחרים, וככה גם הם יתעשרו, או יפתח עוד מפעלים, עוד בתי מלאכה, ויספק פרנסה לעוד אנשים.
Adam Smith had this famous passage in his Wealth of Nations. It is because well, I'm paraphrasing him, but because the bakers and the butchers want to make money, that we can have our dinner. He started all this myth about selfish individual, self-seeking being the predominant and almost exclusive human motivation. Now, one has to grant that Adam Smith was actually a bit more sophisticated than his followers. he actually understood that humans are more complex, but his position was that you could actually separate these things, and in the realm of the economy, selfishness is basically the exclusive motivation.
So you know Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. Self-interest and greed is good, and the invisible hand and free enterprise and free markets, etc. All that kind of, he's the father of capitalism. But it turns out, there's another Adam Smith. How many people here have read The Theory of Moral Sentiments? And according to Adam Smith, it was his important book. It was his magnum opus. In some ways, that was his magnum opus, and The Wealth of Nations paid the bills. He never imagined capitalism that he wrote about in The Wealth of Nations could actually succeed without the moral underpinnings, the moral, what he called sentiments. We would call them virtues. Without the virtues of a society and virtues of individuals that would actually create the base of a healthy capitalism. Well, all you could do is look here and see that The Wealth of Nations and A Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith 1, Adam Smith 2, have been disconnected.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism?
Tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests.
We'll be back in just a moment.
Of course, we are all, to an extent, selfish. Some people more, some people less. But we also have many other motivations. I mean, we have solidarity, we have loyalty, we have sympathy. I mean, all these motivations are real. And we really, need to design a system that exploits all these complex human motivations. Because if you begin to assume that everyone is selfish, everyone's only out to promote his or her own self-interest, and then you have to suspect everyone, you have to monitor everyone all the time, and the system will actually grind to a halt.
The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way.
But Henry Ford is a perfect example that self-interest is far more complex than greed or individualism. In 1914, he single-handedly almost doubled the salaries of his workers and reduced their working hours from 9 to 8 hours a day. Increasing their salaries, he claimed, will turn workers into consumers. It will help to expand the economy and his car sales. He dreamed that every worker could one day own a Ford car.
Non-selfish motivations are important. Then, good managers know it. I mean, they'll talk about, persuading people, connecting to people, providing a vision, creating the esprit de corps,
Tonight, we focus on an apple. Apple the computer, not the fruit.
It is jobs that provides the main inspiration and philosophical direction for Apple.
What Apple is it's an environment where we can attract the best and the brightest people to come together and sort of have a common vision about how we can change the world.
This is how real managers manage the economy, but of course economists do not understand this, and they keep saying that everyone's selfish and we have to design the system accordingly, which means that you give maximum freedom to everyone, and kind of basically that believe that this will somehow amount to optimal social outcome.
So how did Adam Smith's nuanced concept of self-interest become transformed over more than 200 years into a global economic system driven by greed? It begins with the separation of Adam Smith I from Adam Smith II, and the transformation of the wealth of nations into a science.
The doctrine of self-interest was the economic equivalent to the law of gravity. It ensured equilibrium. If everyone was free to pursue their self-interests in markets, you would get an equilibrium, optimal equilibrium, which was equivalent to the equilibrium of natural bodies when they were free to move as well. So I think the analogy with physics was very, very strong. What they ignored completely was how human beings actually behave. Sociology and psychology have been very well aware that a lot of behavior is what economists would call irrational. But in fact, I don't think that is the right way of describing it. I think it's human.
University of Michigan Television presents an interview with Ayn Rand, noted American novelist, author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and philosopher spokesman for America's new intellectuals.
Self-interest had been enshrined as a law of physics in the 19th century. In the first part of the 20th century, it evolved in the US into a moral philosophy.
I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others, that in fact makes man a sacrificial animal. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself. Now, what can be more important than happiness? But happiness does not mean simply momentary pleasures or any kind of mindless self-indulgence. Happiness means a profound, guiltless, rational feeling of self-esteem and of pride in one's own achievement.
Join me in welcoming Paul Ryan.
In the 21st century, Ayn Rand's philosophy of self-interest became part of a political campaign.
I grew up reading Ayn Rand, and it taught me quite a bit about who I am and what my value systems are and what my beliefs are. The issue that is under assault, the attack on democratic capitalism, on individualism and freedom in America, is an attack on the moral foundation of America. And Ayn Rand, more than anyone else, did a fantastic job of explaining the morality of capitalism, the morality of individualism.
Our rights come from nature and God, not from governments.
This kind of approach has been so destructive, especially in the last 20, 30 years. We have come to almost glorify self-interest. I mean, we have come to believe that all the other motivations, all the other emotions, all the other moral values, they are somehow secondary. They are somehow for stupid people. They are somehow for kind of lower beings. That has created this system where people are actually expected to be ignorant of the broader social framework. They are encouraged actually just to look after their own interests, and we are living the consequences today.
There are two words which over the centuries immortalized Adam Smith and the wealth of nations. They've become shorthand for global economic activities, transforming self-interest into a magical mechanism. an engine for a global economic system.
The invisible hand is a phrase that was introduced by Adam Smith in his great book, The Wealth of Nations, in which he talked about the way in which individuals who intended only to pursue their own interests were led by an invisible hand to promote the public welfare, which was no part of their intention.
60-second adventures in economics. Number 1, the invisible hand. An economy is a tricky thing to control, and governments are always trying to figure out how to do it. Back in 1776, economist Adam Smith shocked everyone by saying that what governments should actually do is just leave people alone to buy and sell freely among themselves. He suggested that if they just leave self-interested traders to compete with one another, markets are guided to positive outcomes as if by an invisible hand. If someone
The invisible hand has long been a staple of any economics course.
or offer something better.
Le paradoxe, c'est que ce seul mot a été dupliqué comme le fondement de l'économie de marché. C'est un succès incroyable. Vous avez des dizaines de milliers de mots dans l'ouvrage de Adam Smith, et c'est la main invisible, cité une seule fois.
Yet Adam Smith never wrote it in this context.
Adam Smith was concerned that if there was free movement of capital and free import of goods, he said England will suffer because British capitalists will invest abroad and they'll import from abroad, and that'll harm the English economy. And Adam Smith then gave an argument. It was not a very good argument, but his argument was that English investors will prefer to invest in England because of what some called a home bias. They'll have a preference for investing close by, and therefore, as if by an invisible hand, England will be saved from the menace of free capital movement and of free imports. That's invisible hand. What's that got to do with the Cato Institute or the modern enthusiasm about free capital flow and having U.S. corporations invest in China so they can send stuff back here to sell cheap, exploiting Chinese workers? That's not Adam Smith.
La main invisible est apparue comme la façon de lutter définitivement contre la mainmise de l'État sur la vie économique pour mieux se libérer du féodalisme. Vous voyez, le succès instantané. Et de nos jours, on a remobilisé les années 50 pour essayer de tuer l'état du bien-être, la fiscalité progressive, et dire il faut laisser les agents s'auto-organiser. Mais vous voyez, c'est une réinvention d'une tradition. Cette tradition n'a pas joué un rôle actif tout au long du XIXe siècle. C'est une réinvention moderne à des fins d'action sur la politique économique contemporaine.
Committee will please come to order. Today is our fourth hearing into the ongoing financial crisis.
In 2009, in the wake of the financial collapse, Alan Greenspan, the former head of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve Board, was invited back to Washington as the man who, more than others, promoted deregulation in the name of the invisible hand.
Today in this hearing, Dr. Greenspan, I want to start with you. You have been a staunch advocate for letting markets regulate themselves. And my question for you is simple. Were you wrong?
I found a flaw.
You found a flaw
in the model that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
Which model was he referring to? Alan Greenspan's intellectual career began with Ayn Rand. He was among her disciples, an enthusiastic believer in her theory of the supremacy of rationality.
It is only since the Industrial Revolution, the birth of a free society, the society of capitalism, that there was a new class of men, which is the free producers of material goods, the businessmen, the industrialists. That is the man who lives by means of reason. That is the man who, in his psychoepistemology, is not guided by his immediate perceptions nor by his emotions, but by logic, by his concepts, by reason. That is the man whom I call the producer.
When Alan Greenspan was nominated years later by then-President Gerald Ford to head his Council of Economic Advisors, Greenspan paid tribute to his old master and invited her to meet the president. Three years before the financial meltdown, Alan Greenspan visited Kirkcaldy, Adam Smith's birthplace, in commemoration of the great thinker. One could hardly imagine, Greenspan said, that today's awesome array of international transactions would produce the relative economic stability that we experience daily if they were not led by some international version of Smith's invisible hand.
In recent decades, a vast risk management and pricing system has evolved, combining the best insights of mathematicians and finance experts. The whole intellectual edifice, however, collapsed in the summer of last year.
And so, with magical and mystical words like invisible hand, words which were taken out of context, the intellectual structure of free market was created.
People, of course, have different views on whether free market is desirable. So some people believe that we should leave the markets free. Other people say the free markets are not very good. We have to intervene in it to ensure social justice and equity and so on. But most people would actually accept that there is such thing as a free market. I mean, you may or may not like the free market, but you will know it when you see it. But that's the biggest myth about capitalism, because my question is, what do you actually mean by the free market? And then to illustrate this point, I bring in the example of child labor. Today, in all the rich countries, there's restrictions on child labor. But there was a time when child labor was a very widespread thing. Famous author Daniel Defoe in the 1720s famously praised certain regions of England that were producing textile for being able to offer employment to children from the age of 4 or 5 and allowing them to make a living. In the early 19th century, in the British Parliament, a group of social reformers made the very first attempt to actually officially regulate child labor. Now, even then, a lot of people were against this regulation because they said this regulation is trying to undermine the very foundation of a free market, namely the freedom of contract. So they said, these children want to work, these people want to employ them. What is your problem? Now, today, a lot of people will find this argument absurd because people accept that there are certain contracts that society should override in the interest of general welfare. So the example of child labor beautifully illustrates how markets are essentially a political construct. all markets are propped up by a huge range of regulations. I mean, I liken it to the piano wires that these kung fu masters are using Hong Kong the martial arts movies. Markets are like that. I mean, once you accept the underlying political values of certain regulations, these regulations become invisible, like those piano wires.
Do we remember slavery? A true free market without those piano wires, where the only considerations were profit and losses. A market which was once widely accepted as the norm. One of the first to identify the intellectual foundations on which slavery was built, the ability to separate economic logic from social and human reality, was a contemporary of Adam Smith, a former slave, and a philosopher too. He's buried here in Shama, Ghana, in the shadow of a former slave castle.
We have gathered around his tomb. He has to give glory to God for giving us this wonderful philosopher.
Anton Wilhelm Amo set out to criticize the very contradiction of creating a science as separate from the human reality of capitalism. Amo's journey began, as do those of so many before him, on a slave ship out of Africa.
Among the enslaved who came in, among the people who were being made into commodities, were people who were from some of the courts. Some of them, when they were brought in, immediately showed their precocity. Amo was brought as a blackamoor to Holland. He was manumitted, and he was educated and adopted within the aristocracy. He was educated to the point where he achieved 2 doctorates, a doctorate in law and a doctorate in philosophy. And he taught in the German university system.
Amo, der erste Schwarzafrikaner, der an einer europäischen Universität studiert hat, hat sich bei uns eingetragen, und zwar unter der Nummer 488. Das ist der 9. Juli 1727 gewesen.
Amo was brought to Europe as a child by the Dutch East India Company and was given as a present to a German duke. The liberal duke freed him and provided him with a free education.
The thing that begins to emerge when these commodities begin to speak is they began to articulate the double standards and some of the problems in the processes of rationalization that were going on in modern capitalism.
I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen if nature had not made an original distinction between these breeds of men. David Hume, philosopher, Adam Smith's intellectual partner.
With Amo, you have first the question of the anthropological rationalization. Amo wrote on the equalities of the Moors in Europe, and the very act of writing it, the very act of articulating, was to unsettle the view that something about him racially necessitated his being a tool. As we know, René Descartes, the famous French philosopher, articulated reality as being dual, having mind and body. Well, Amo basically said that if mind were really separated from body, mind couldn't feel anything. Amo began to deal with this problem of how rationality and reason was being used, ironically, against reality and reason. If we look at the way Adam Smith would argue, he was articulating a system that sets up as an ideal world, paradoxically, a world without people. People tend to want to be free, people tend to have values, people tend to be not as neatly predictable.
In 18th century Europe, a warning from an African philosopher was doomed to be ignored. Amo had to flee Europe and died here in Shama. While The Wealth of Nations pioneered modern economics, Amo's books were burned and his work is all but forgotten.
Je crois qu'Adam Smith commence à raisonner, comme va le faire l'économie après lui, sur un monde en partie virtuel, en partie déconnecté de tous ces éléments de violence. C'est vrai qu'au cœur de ces thèses, il n'y a pas du tout, évidemment, cette prise en compte de la violence occidentale qui a existé pourtant dans les 3 siècles qui le précèdent.
כמו שבאמת בתקופה של סמית עצמו, אז הקפיטליזם חשף את הפנים המכוערות שלו דרך סחר העבדים, שהונע מחוסר אכפתיות כלפי העבדים, וההתייחסות לסחר העבדים ולכל העבודה של העבדים במשקפיים כלכליות טהורות. מספרים, רווח, הפסד, לא מעניין אותי שום דבר אחר, אז ככה התייחסו לבני אדם. אז היום כבר אין עבדות של בני אדם, אנחנו רואים בדיוק את אותה תופעה, את אותו תהליך, קורה עם היחס לבעלי חיים.
The footage you're about to see was recorded with a hidden camera at Highline Hatchery in Iowa, the world's largest hatchery for egg-laying breed chicks.
Nothing in The Wealth of Nations condones slavery, and of course it has nothing to do with the meat industry of today. Yet this is how Adam Smith's vision of the market evolved, once his followers regarded it as a science and divorced it from all social ties.
These male chicks are killed by being dropped into a grinding machine while still alive.
שגם שם אומרים בעלי חיים, בתעשיית הבשר, הביצים, החלב, שמים את המשקפיים, הכל מספרים, הכל רווח, הפסד, מניות, אחוזים, ביקוש, היצע, שוכחים שיש לנו פה עסק עם יצורים חיים.
Here a worker uses a hot cautery device to painfully burn off the calf's horns, a common dairy industry practice known as disbudding. No anesthesia was used to reduce the calf's pain during this harsh and invasive mutilation.
ואף אחד לא חושב על זה, זאת אומרת, מי שפותח את המקרר או להוציא חלב לשים בקפה, הוא לא חושב על זה שמשם הגיע החלב שלו. אבל אין פה שנאה. אף אחד לא שונא פרות. בדרך כלל הקרטון חלב יהיה מאותר בציורים של פרה מחייכת ושמחה. אנחנו רוצים שהפרה, לא רוצים שיהיה להם רע. הם פשוט לא חושבים עליהם. ומה שמאפשר לנו לא לחשוב עליהם זה באמת האופן שבו בנויה הכלכלה הקפיטליסטית. הכלכלה באמת, העולם שאדם סמית חוזה, עולם שיש בו אך ורק רווח והפסד וביקוש והיצע ומספרים, וכל השאלות וכל השיקולים של מוסר ושל דת וכן הדברים האלה, להוציא את זה החוצה.
Smith was very skeptical about whether, in fact, a science of society or a science of economics was actually possible. Smith is always deeply cautious about how free markets should be implemented. The questions which Smith thought were exceedingly difficult to address about social justice, about fairness, and about maintaining the fabric of society itself might actually be impossible to address. In the course of history, we have lost all that thinking about the political dimensions, the ethical dimensions of progress towards a full market economy.
J'ai une grande admiration pour Smith parce qu'il est anticipateur du capitalisme. Smith anticipe le caractère révolutionnaire de la division du travail qui va en proportion de la taille du marché. Et alors moi, j'ai toujours vu Smith comme ayant un siècle d'avance par rapport aux autres théoriciens, alors que tous les successeurs vont avoir quelques siècles, un demi-siècle de retard. Et pour aller jusqu'à la plaisanterie, la théorie néoclassique actuelle a un siècle de retard.
So how and why, in the process of trying to convert the wealth of nations into reality, were Adam Smith's ethical and political concerns lost? Greed won, and societies were restructured along the logic of the market.